Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. The city's subway system was a labyrinth of tunnels, twisting beneath the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers. Among the many lines, the Midnight Line, officially named Line 13, was an oddity. It was rarely used, its stations almost always empty, and its service hours were peculiar. It only ran from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. Most commuters avoided it, citing rumors of strange occurrences, eerie encounters, and stories that bordered on the supernatural. For years, the Midnight Line remained a mystery, a secret whispered about among those who dared to ride it. But for Samir Patel, a struggling journalist desperate for a story, it was an opportunity. Samir had spent months pitching stories to his editor at the city paper, only to be met with rejection. He needed something fresh, something gripping, something that would make people talk. The Midnight Line, with its haunted reputation, seemed perfect. Armed with a digital recorder, a camera, and a notebook, Samir decided to ride the line for a week, documenting everything he experienced. He hoped to uncover the truth behind the rumors, whether they were urban legends or something more sinister. On the first night, Samir arrived at the Midnight Line's main station, Haven Street, just before 11 p.m. The station was eerily quiet, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly. The air was damp, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust and something else, something he couldn't quite place. The train arrived precisely at 11 p.m. Its exterior was older than the city's other subway cars, with faded paint and windows clouded with grime. Samir boarded cautiously, noting that the car was almost empty save for a few silent passengers. As the train pulled away from the station, Samir settled into a seat and began taking notes. The first hour passed uneventfully. The train stopped at various stations, though no one seemed to get on or off. The passengers sat quietly, their faces obscured by shadows. It wasn't until the train approached Dusk Hollow Station, a stop he had never heard of, that Samir began to feel uneasy. The air grew colder, and the lights inside the car flickered. When the train stopped, the doors opened onto a platform shrouded in mist. No one moved. Samir leaned forward, peering through the fog. He thought he saw figures moving in the distance, vague, translucent shapes that seemed to float rather than walk. The doors closed abruptly, and the train lurched forward, leaving Dusk Hollow behind. Samir's heart raced, but he convinced himself it was just his imagination. By the third night, Samir was starting to notice patterns. The same passengers were on the train every night, sitting in the same seats, wearing the same clothes. None of them spoke or made eye contact. At Pale Creek Station, a man boarded the train, a disheveled figure clutching a tattered briefcase. He looked out of place among the silent passengers, his eyes darting nervously around the car. Samir decided to approach him. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice low. Are you riding the Midnight Line for a reason?" The man flinched but nodded. "I missed my stop 2 nights ago," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I've been trying to find my way back ever since." Samir frowned. "What do you mean? Can't you just get off at the next station?" The man shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "It doesn't work like that. Once you miss your stop, you're stuck. The train, it doesn't let you leave." Before Samir could ask more, the train lights flickered and the man froze. His face went pale, and he gripped his briefcase tighter. "Don't look at them," he muttered. "Look at who?" Samir asked. The man pointed toward the windows. Samir turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Outside, shadowy figures pressed against the glass, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The train sped up, and the figures vanished. On the 5th night, Samir noticed the Midnight Line's route had changed. The stations it stopped at weren't listed on the subway maps, and the train's announcements were distorted, the station names garbled and incomprehensible. At Eclipse Crossing Station, the train came to an abrupt halt. This time, all the passengers stood and exited, moving in unison like puppets. Samir hesitated before following them. The station was unlike any he had seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. The passengers walked toward a massive archway at the end of the platform, their movements mechanical. Beyond the archway, Samir saw a sprawling landscape, a dark, barren wasteland illuminated by a blood-red sky. Shadows flitted across the horizon, their shapes too twisted to be human. A chilling realization hit him. This was no ordinary subway station. This was another realm. Samir's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but curiosity and the promise of a groundbreaking story kept him rooted in place. He raised his camera and snapped a photo. The flash seemed to anger the shadows. A deafening roar echoed through the station, and the passengers turned toward him, their faces blank and their eyes glowing faintly. "Leave!" a voice boomed, though it came from no one in particular. Samir stumbled backward, dropping his camera. The passengers advanced, their movements unnatural, their limbs jerking like marionettes. He bolted back to the train, the doors closing just as the passengers reached the platform. On the 7th night, Samir didn't ride the midnight line. He spent the day reviewing his footage and photographs, hoping to make sense of what he had experienced. In every photo, the shadows were there, looming, watching. One image from the wasteland showed a massive skeletal figure in the distance, its hollow eyes glowing like embers. Samir's recorder captured strange whispers and distant screams. When he played the tape backward, he heard a single chilling phrase repeated over and over: "The living don't belong here." That night, Samir received an email from an anonymous sender. The message was brief: "You've seen too much. They won't let you leave." Despite his fear, Samir felt compelled to ride the midnight line one last time. He needed answers. When he arrived at Haven Street Station, the train was waiting for him. This time it was empty. As the train moved, the lights flickered and the familiar cold settled in. The train didn't stop at any stations. Instead, it plunged deeper into the tunnels, the windows revealing only darkness. Samir felt the air grow heavier, the sense of dread overwhelming. Finally, the train came to a stop. The doors opened onto a void, a vast, endless expanse of darkness. A voice echoed through the car. "You were warned." The shadows swarmed inside, and Samir's screams were swallowed by the abyss. Weeks later, Samir's editor received a package containing his notebook, recorder, and camera. The photos and recordings painted a horrifying picture, but Samir himself was never found. The midnight line continued to run, its trains empty except for the occasional soul brave or foolish enough to board. And deep within the tunnels, if you listened closely, you could still hear Samir's voice, whispering a warning to anyone who dared to enter. Don't miss your stop. The small town of Redfield sat on the edge of a vast, rocky desert, a region that had seen its share of wars over the centuries. To the locals, the land was cursed, bearing scars that never healed, rusted remnants of weapons, craters filled with sand, and whispers of the dead carried by the wind. Few dared venture there after dark. When an international conflict erupted and modern armies established a battlefield on the outskirts of Redfield, the town's elders warned the soldiers. "This land doesn't forget," one old man said gravely, "and neither do its dead." Of course, no one listened. Among the soldiers was Corporal Marcus Reyes, a pragmatic man who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, war was a brutal reality, not a place for myths. His unit had been stationed near the desolate battlefield for months, their days spent in drills and skirmishes, their nights filled with uneasy rest in makeshift barracks. But strange things began to happen after the first battle. It started subtly. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps at night, crunching over the dry sand outside their tents. Others claimed they saw a lone figure walking the battlefield during the pre-dawn hours, clad in an old tattered uniform not of their army, or any modern army. One night, while on guard duty, Marcus caught sight of the figure for the first time. The man stood atop a ridge overlooking the battlefield, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. He wore a faded uniform with patches Marcus couldn't identify, and his posture was rigid, almost statuesque. "Identify yourself," Marcus called, raising his rifle. The figure didn't move. Marcus's partner, Private Carter, aimed his flashlight at the ridge, but the light passed through the figure as if he weren't there. "What the hell?" Carter muttered, his voice trembling. Before Marcus could respond, the figure vanished. The sightings became more frequent. Soldiers whispered about the ghost of Redfield, a spectral soldier who appeared after battles, wandering among the wreckage and bodies. It wasn't until a particularly fierce skirmish left the battlefield littered with casualties that Marcus encountered the ghost again, this time up close. He had been tasked with searching for survivors among the debris. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint whistle of the wind. As Marcus stepped over the wreckage of a burned-out vehicle, he saw him. The ghost was kneeling beside a fallen soldier, his transparent hands brushing the man's bloodied face. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. The ghost turned to him, and for the first time Marcus saw his face. He was young, no older than 20, with a gaunt expression and hollow eyes that seemed to peer through Marcus rather than at him. His uniform was old, patched with fraying stitches and stained with dirt and blood. A rusted rifle hung loosely over his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here," the ghost said, his voice a hollow echo. Marcus's mouth went dry. Who are you?" The ghost stood, his form flickering like a flame. "I am no one, just a soldier, like you." Determined to learn more, Marcus began asking the locals about the ghost. Most were reluctant to speak, but eventually an elderly historian named Mr. Delgado shared the tale. "Long ago," Delgado began, "this land was the site of a terrible war. It wasn't the kind of war you read about in history books. It was a conflict of desperation, small, forgotten factions fighting for survival, their soldiers nameless and unremembered." "Why does he haunt the battlefield?" Marcus asked. Delgado's eyes darkened. "Because he was abandoned, left to die alone, his sacrifice unacknowledged. His soul can't find rest because no one remembers his name, his face, or the cause he fought for." The ghost began appearing to Marcus more frequently, as if drawn to him. Unlike the others, Marcus wasn't afraid. He felt a strange connection to the spectral soldier, a sense of shared purpose that transcended time. One night, the ghost spoke to him again. "You're all repeating the same mistakes," the ghost said, gesturing to the barren battlefield. "This land doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the dead." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The ghost pointed to the horizon, where faint silhouettes of other spectral soldiers began to emerge. Dozens, then hundreds. They were dressed in uniforms from different eras, their faces etched with sorrow and anger. "They're coming," the ghost said, "and they won't stop until this land is at peace." The next night, chaos erupted. The soldiers stationed on the battlefield reported seeing phantom troops marching through the desert, their spectral weapons gleaming under the moonlight. At first, the living soldiers thought it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when the ghosts began to attack, it became clear that they were real, at least in some way. Bullets passed through the phantoms without harm, while the ghosts' attacks caused unexplainable injuries and terror. Equipment malfunctioned, radios emitted only static, and the air grew thick with the cries of the forgotten dead. Marcus found himself face to face with the young ghost again, this time in the middle of the battlefield. "You have to stop this," Marcus pleaded. The ghost shook his head. "It's too late. The dead demand justice." Realizing the futility of fighting the ghosts, Marcus devised a plan. He remembered Delgado's words. The ghost was restless because he had been forgotten. If Marcus could give him a name, a story, perhaps he could be at peace. Marcus returned to the battlefield alone, carrying a notebook and a makeshift memorial he had crafted from scrap metal. He found the ghost standing among the wreckage, watching the spectral army advance. "I want to remember you," Marcus said, holding up the notebook. "Tell me your story." The ghost hesitated, his translucent form wavering. Finally, he spoke. "My name was Elias Grant," he said. "I was 19 when I died here. We were promised reinforcements, but they never came. We were left to rot." Marcus wrote down every word, creating a record of Elias's life and death. He placed the memorial on the battlefield, engraving Elias's name into the metal. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the ghostly army began to fade. Elias stood beside Marcus, his expression softer now. "Thank you," he said. "You've done what no one else would." Elias saluted Marcus before dissolving into the morning light, leaving behind only the faint scent of earth and iron. Word of Marcus's actions spread among his comrades and the locals. They established a proper memorial on the battlefield, honoring not just Elias but all the forgotten soldiers who had perished there. The hauntings ceased, and the land grew quiet. But Marcus knew the ghosts were still there, watching, ensuring that the living never forgot the cost of war. And every year on the anniversary of Elias's death, Marcus returned to the memorial, standing vigil for the soldier who had finally found peace. There were many strange stories about the old elevator in the Garamond building, an otherwise unremarkable office structure in the heart of the city. Most people ignored the rumors, brushing them off as urban legends. But those who dared to ride the elevator late at night told unsettling tales. The destinations weren't normal floors, but places filled with terror and ghosts of the past. Maintenance crews avoided working on it, claiming they heard voices in the shaft. Tenants never used it unless they had no other choice. And the stories were all consistent. Once you entered, the elevator took you where it wanted, not where you asked to go. One rainy night, Lisa Harding, an overworked paralegal, discovered just how real the legend was. Lisa had been burning the midnight oil again, preparing documents for an important trial. By the time she left her office on the 19th floor, the building was deserted, save for the security guard dozing at the front desk. The regular elevators were out of service. Red tape crisscrossed their doors, accompanied by a sign reading, "Out of order." That left only the old service elevator at the end of the hallway. Lisa hesitated. She'd heard the stories, of course, but it was late, she was exhausted, and the idea of walking down 19 flights of stairs was unbearable. "It's just an elevator," she muttered, pressing the call button. The elevator arrived with a deep, mechanical groan. Its doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit, shabby interior. The brass panel inside was tarnished, its buttons worn smooth. Lisa stepped in, the doors closing behind her with an unsettling finality. Lisa pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator shuddered and began its descent, the hum of the machinery unnervingly loud in the silent building. But when it stopped, the floor indicator didn't show 1. Instead, it flickered and displayed B3. Confused, Lisa frowned. "Basement level 3? This building doesn't even have a basement." The door slid open, revealing an impossibly long, dimly lit hallway lined with rusted pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. A chill seeped into the elevator, carrying the faint stench of mildew and something metallic. Lisa stared, her pulse quickening. At the far end of the hallway, she saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadows. Its head jerked unnaturally as it turned toward her, and its glowing eyes locked onto hers. The figure began to move, its steps echoing ominously down the hall. "Nope," Lisa whispered, slamming the closed door button repeatedly. The elevator obeyed, the doors sliding shut just as the figure broke into a sprint. The elevator jolted and began moving again, its hum rising to a nervous whine. When the elevator stopped again, Lisa's heart sank. The floor indicator now read 7, but this wasn't the 7th floor she knew. The doors opened to a lavishly decorated ballroom, frozen in a bygone era. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light dim and flickering. Tables were set with fine china, and a bandstand stood empty at the far end of the room. At first it seemed deserted. Then the music started, a haunting, tinny waltz that echoed through the space. Couples in elegant, tattered clothing materialized on the dance floor, their faces pale and unnervingly expressionless. They moved in perfect synchrony, their feet gliding over the polished floor as if they floated. One of the dancers stopped mid-step and turned to look at Lisa. Its eyes were sunken pits, its mouth a hollow void. "Join us," it rasped, extending a skeletal hand toward her. Lisa stumbled back, frantically hitting random buttons on the control panel. The dancers turned in unison, their empty eyes fixed on her as the music grew louder and more dissonant. The door slid shut, cutting off the cacophony, and the elevator groaned as it ascended again. Breathing heavily, Lisa pressed her back against the wall, clutching her briefcase like a lifeline. The elevator stopped again, but this time the panel flickered erratically before settling on a glowing error. A voice crackled through the speaker above her, distorted and inhuman. "Do you know why you're here?" it asked. Lisa's stomach dropped. "What? No, I didn't mean to." "This is not your first visit," the voice continued, ignoring her protests. "You carry guilt. That is why the elevator chose you." Lisa's mind raced. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." The voice laughed, a low guttural sound that made her skin crawl. "We'll see." The doors opened once more. This time, the elevator revealed a place Lisa recognized, her childhood home. The small two-story house stood under a pale, sickly moonlight, its windows dark and foreboding. "No," Lisa whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the elevator wouldn't close. Something compelled her to step out, her legs moving against her will. The front door creaked open as she approached, revealing the living room frozen in time. The furniture was exactly as she remembered, right down to the faded couch and the cracked coffee table. In the center of the room stood a figure, a young boy, no older than 10. He turned to face her, his eyes wide and accusing. "Why didn't you help me?" he asked, his voice trembling with pain. Lisa's breath hitched. Memories she had buried deep came rushing back. Her younger brother Jonah, drowning in the river behind their house. She had been there but had been too afraid to jump in after him. I couldn't," Lisa stammered, tears streaming down her face. "I was just a kid." The boy's face twisted with anger. "You could have tried." The room began to collapse around her, the walls cracking and the floor crumbling into darkness. Lisa screamed as the boy's face dissolved into a twisted, ghostly visage, his cries echoing in her ears. Lisa staggered back into the elevator just as the doors closed. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. The voice returned, softer this time. "You can't escape your past, but you can choose what to do with it." The elevator began to rise faster and faster. The floor indicator cycled through nonsensical symbols, and the hum grew to a deafening roar. Lisa clutched the railing, convinced the elevator was going to tear itself apart. But then it stopped. The doors opened to the familiar lobby of the Garamond building. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened. Lisa stumbled out, looking back to see the elevator doors closing behind her. The floor indicator blinked once, and then displayed 19, as if it had never moved. Lisa never spoke of what happened that night, but she quit her job the next day. She returned home, reconnecting with her family and finally visiting Jonah's grave. The elevator remained in the Garamond building, its legend growing with each passing year. Some said it was cursed, a portal to places where people confronted their deepest fears and regrets. Others believed it was a force for redemption, giving its passengers a chance to make peace with their past. But one thing was certain, those who rode the elevator after midnight never came back the same. There were many strange stories about the old elevator in the Garamond building, an otherwise unremarkable office structure in the heart of the city. Most people ignored the rumors, brushing them off as urban legends. But those who dared to ride the elevator late at night told unsettling tales. The destinations weren't normal floors, but places filled with terror and ghosts of the past. Maintenance crews avoided working on it, claiming they heard voices in the shaft. Tenants never used it unless they had no other choice. And the stories were all consistent. Once you entered, the elevator took you where it wanted, not where you asked to go. One rainy night, Lisa Harding, an overworked paralegal, discovered just how real the legend was. Lisa had been burning the midnight oil again, preparing documents for an important trial. By the time she left her office on the 19th floor, the building was deserted, save for the security guard dozing at the front desk. The regular elevators were out of service. Red tape crisscrossed their doors, accompanied by a sign reading, "Out of order." That left only the old service elevator at the end of the hallway. Lisa hesitated. She'd heard the stories, of course. But it was late, she was exhausted, and the idea of walking down 19 flights of stairs was unbearable. "It's just an elevator," she muttered, pressing the call button. The elevator arrived with a deep mechanical groan. Its doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit, shabby interior. The brass panel inside was tarnished, its buttons worn smooth. Lisa stepped in, the doors closing behind her with an unsettling finality. Lisa pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator shuddered and began its descent, the hum of the machinery unnervingly loud in the silent building. But when it stopped, the floor indicator didn't show 1. Instead, it flickered and displayed B3. Confused, Lisa frowned. "Basement level 3? This building doesn't even have a basement." The doors slid open, revealing an impossibly long, dimly lit hallway lined with rusted pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. A chill seeped into the elevator, carrying the faint stench of mildew and something metallic. Lisa stared, her pulse quickening. At the far end of the hallway, she saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadows. Its head jerked unnaturally as it turned toward her, and its glowing eyes locked onto hers. The figure began to move, its steps echoing ominously down the hall. "Nope," Lisa whispered, slamming the closed door button repeatedly. The elevator obeyed, the doors sliding shut just as the figure broke into a sprint. The elevator jolted and began moving again, its hum rising to a nervous whine. When the elevator stopped again, Lisa's heart sank. The floor indicator now read 7, but this wasn't the 7th floor she knew. The doors opened to a lavishly decorated ballroom, frozen in a bygone era. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light dim and flickering. Tables were set with fine china, and a bandstand stood empty at the far end of the room. At first it seemed deserted. Then the music started, a haunting, tinny waltz that echoed through the space. Couples in elegant, tattered clothing materialized on the dance floor, their faces pale and unnervingly expressionless. They moved in perfect synchrony, their feet gliding over the polished floor as if they floated. One of the dancers stopped mid-step and turned to look at Lisa. Its eyes were sunken pits, its mouth a hollow void. "Join us," it rasped, extending a skeletal hand toward her. Lisa stumbled back, frantically hitting random buttons on the control panel. The dancers turned in unison, their empty eyes fixed on her as the music grew louder and more dissonant. The doors slid shut, cutting off the cacophony, and the elevator groaned as it ascended again. Breathing heavily, Lisa pressed her back against the wall, clutching her briefcase like a lifeline. The elevator stopped again, but this time the panel flickered erratically before settling on a glowing error. A voice crackled through the speaker above her, distorted and inhuman. "Do you know why you're here?" it asked. Lisa's stomach dropped. "What? No, I didn't mean to. This is not your first visit," the voice continued, ignoring her protests. "You carry guilt. That is why the elevator chose you." Lisa's mind raced. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that made her skin crawl. "We'll see." The doors opened once more. This time the elevator revealed a place Lisa recognized, her childhood home. The small, two-story house stood under a pale, sickly moonlight, its windows dark and foreboding. "No," Lisa whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the elevator wouldn't close. Something compelled her to step out, her legs moving against her will. The front door creaked open as she approached, revealing the living room frozen in time. The furniture was exactly as she remembered, right down to the faded couch and the cracked coffee table. In the center of the room stood a figure, a young boy no older than 10. He turned to face her, his eyes wide and accusing. "Why didn't you help me?" he asked, his voice trembling with pain. Lisa's breath hitched. Memories she had buried deep came rushing back. Her younger brother, Jonah, drowning in the river behind their house. She had been there, but had been too afraid to jump in after him. I couldn't," Lisa stammered, tears streaming down her face. "I was just a kid." The boy's face twisted with anger. "You could have tried." The room began to collapse around her, the walls cracking and the floor crumbling into darkness. Lisa screamed as the boy's face dissolved into a twisted, ghostly visage, his cries echoing in her ears. Lisa staggered back into the elevator just as the doors closed. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. The voice returned, softer this time. "You can't escape your past, but you can choose what to do with it." The elevator began to rise, faster and faster. The floor indicator cycled through nonsensical symbols, and the hum grew to a deafening roar. Lisa clutched the railing, convinced the elevator was going to tear itself apart. But then it stopped. The doors opened to the familiar lobby of the Garamond building. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened. Lisa stumbled out, looking back to see the elevator doors closing behind her. The floor indicator blinked once and then displayed 19 as if it had never moved. Lisa never spoke of what happened that night, but she quit her job the next day. She returned home, reconnecting with her family and finally visiting Jonah's grave. The elevator remained in the Garamond building, its legend growing with each passing year. Some said it was cursed, a portal to places where people confronted their deepest fears and regrets. Others believed it was a force for redemption, giving its passengers a chance to make peace with their past. But one thing was certain: those who rode the elevator after midnight never came back the same. It was a quiet autumn evening when Emma Wilkes discovered the music box at a small, cluttered antique shop in the heart of the old town. The shopkeeper, a frail elderly man with deep-set eyes, seemed reluctant to sell it to her. "You don't want that," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's peculiar." Emma, an avid collector of vintage oddities, brushed off his concerns. The ornate craftsmanship of the box, a delicate wooden structure adorned with intricate carvings of roses and spiraling vines, was too beautiful to resist. Besides, she loved music boxes. "Don't wind it up," the shopkeeper added as she paid. "It doesn't need it, and don't let it play at night." Emma smiled politely, assuming his warnings were just a sales tactic to make the item seem mysterious. She took the box home, placing it on her mantelpiece as the centerpiece of her collection. But that night, the music box had other plans. Around midnight, Emma woke to the faint sound of music drifting through her small apartment. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a lilting tune that sent shivers down her spine. She got out of bed and followed the sound to the living room. There on the mantelpiece, the music box was open and playing. Its tiny ballerina twirled gracefully, casting long shadows on the walls. Emma frowned. She was certain she hadn't wound it up. "Maybe it's old and temperamental," she muttered, closing the lid. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. She returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. She felt as if someone, or something, was watching her. The next morning, Emma told her best friend Clara about the incident over coffee. Clara, ever the skeptic, laughed. "Come on, Emma. It's just a quirky old music box, probably a mechanical glitch." Emma nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Still, she decided to keep an eye on it. That evening, as the sun set and shadows lengthened, the music box began to play again. This time, Emma was in the same room when it happened. She hadn't touched it. She watched in stunned silence as the lid creaked open and the ballerina began her dance. The tune was the same as before, but there was something unsettling about it. Notes that felt heavier, almost mournful, as if they carried the weight of sorrow. And then she saw it, a faint, translucent figure reflected in the glass of the music box. A woman in a tattered dress stood behind her, her face obscured by a veil. Emma spun around, but no one was there. The next day, Emma returned to the antique shop, clutching the music box tightly. The shopkeeper sighed when he saw her. "I told you not to take it," he said. "Why is it doing this?" Emma demanded. "What's wrong with it?" The old man gestured for her to sit, then began his tale. The music box had once belonged to a young woman named Lillian Grace, a talented pianist who lived in the late 1800s. Lillian had been engaged to a wealthy man named Henry, but their love was fraught with tragedy. On the eve of their wedding, Henry died in a mysterious accident. Heartbroken, Lillian poured all her grief into composing a final piece of music. She had the melody crafted into a music box, which became her constant companion. Lillian herself vanished shortly after, and the music box was passed from owner to owner, each reporting strange occurrences, phantom figures, inexplicable cold drafts, and whispers in the night. "It's cursed," the shopkeeper said solemnly. "Lillian's spirit lingers in the melody, searching for something or someone." Emma didn't believe in ghosts, but the evidence was hard to ignore. "Why me?" she asked. The shopkeeper shook his head. "That, I don't know, but the box chooses its owners. It doesn't leave them easily." That night, Emma placed the music box in a drawer, hoping to silence it, but the melody seeped through the wood, growing louder as midnight approached. She sat up in bed, clutching her blankets as the room grew unnaturally cold. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and move. Then they appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their faces pale and blurred, as if seen through foggy glass. They moved toward the music box, drawn to its song. Emma froze in terror as the spirits surrounded her. They didn't speak, but seemed to be searching, their eyes filled with a mix of longing and sorrow. One of them, a woman with a veiled face, reached out toward Emma. Her touch was cold and fleeting, like a winter breeze. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice fragile and broken. The next day, Emma decided she needed answers. She delved into the town's archives, researching Lillian Grace's life and mysterious disappearance. She discovered that Lillian's death had never been confirmed. Some believed she had drowned herself in the river where Henry had died, while others speculated she had gone mad with grief and disappeared into the wilderness. Emma also found a photograph of Lillian in an old newspaper. The veiled woman from the music box was her. That night, Emma decided to confront the music box directly. She sat in her living room, the music box on the coffee table before her. With trembling hands, she opened the lid. The melody began immediately, softer this time, almost inviting. The ballerina twirled as if beckoning Emma closer. "Lillian," Emma said aloud, feeling foolish but desperate. "What do you want?" The room grew colder, and Lillian's ghost appeared again, more solid than before. Her eyes, visible through the veil, were filled with tears. "I want him," she said. "I want Henry." Emma realized the spirits drawn to the music box were like Lillian, lost souls tethered to their grief, unable to move on. "Can I help you find him?" Emma asked. Lillian nodded, her expression pleading. Emma decided to take the music box to the river where Henry had died. She believed it might be the key to freeing Lillian's spirit. At midnight, she placed the music box on the riverbank and opened it. The melody echoed through the still night, haunting and beautiful. The air grew heavy, and the water began to ripple unnaturally. Then from the mist, another figure emerged. A young man in a formal suit, his face filled with love and sorrow. "Lillian," he whispered. Lillian appeared beside Emma, her ghostly form trembling as she reached out to him. The two spirits embraced, their forms glowing brighter as the melody swelled. "Thank you," Lillian said to Emma, her voice soft and filled with peace. The two ghosts faded into the night, the music box falling silent for the first time. Emma returned home, placing the now silent music box back on her mantelpiece. She never saw Lillian or the other spirits again, but she often felt a comforting presence in her apartment, as if the ghosts were watching over her. The melody no longer played, but Emma would occasionally hear it in her dreams, a soft, mournful tune that reminded her of the power of love, loss, and redemption. The music box remained with her, a testament to the souls it had reunited and the peace it had finally found. In the small, unassuming town of Black Hollow, there was an old art gallery known as the Wainwright Collection. It wasn't popular or flashy, and its dusty halls were rarely visited except by the occasional art enthusiast or curious tourist. But one painting in the gallery had earned a dark reputation over the years, a piece known simply as the Portrait of Shadows. The painting was a masterpiece of disturbing beauty. It depicted a pale, sorrowful woman sitting in a dimly lit room, her dark eyes filled with anguish. Her hands clutched a single rose, its petals black as night. The background of the painting was an amorphous void, shadows swirling in shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of your eye. Locals claimed the painting was cursed, that it caused viewers to see things, horrible, personal things. Some said they saw their worst fears, others their deepest regrets. A few who gazed at the painting for too long reportedly went mad. Yet despite the rumors, or perhaps because of them, people continued to visit the gallery, unable to resist the allure of the Portrait of Shadows. The painting had been part of the Wainwright collection for decades, donated anonymously under mysterious circumstances. The gallery's curator, Margaret Hensley, remembered the day it arrived. It was a stormy night, and a delivery man had brought the painting wrapped in a thick black cloth. No sender was listed, and the only documentation was a single note that read, "This piece belongs to Black Hollow. Handle with care. Do not destroy it." Margaret had been skeptical, but intrigued. She had the painting unwrapped and hung in the main gallery, immediately noticing the eerie effect it had on her staff. "It's watching us," one assistant murmured. Margaret dismissed their fears, believing them to be the result of overactive imaginations. But it wasn't long before she began hearing strange reports from visitors. One of the first incidents involved a young art student named Lily, who had visited the gallery for inspiration. She stood before the painting for an unusually long time, her face pale and her eyes unblinking. When Margaret approached her, concerned, Lily began to scream. "I see them!" she cried, backing away from the painting. "They're dead!" They're all dead. Lily later explained that she had seen her family members lying in a burning house, their faces twisted in agony. The vision was so vivid that she believed it was real, even though her family was alive and well. After that, Margaret considered removing the painting from display, but its notoriety began to attract more visitors, and the gallery's struggling finances couldn't afford to lose the attention. Years later, a journalist named Daniel Ford arrived in Black Hollow, determined to uncover the truth behind the painting's curse. Daniel was a skeptic, believing the so-called curse to be nothing more than mass hysteria fueled by urban legends. He arranged an interview with Margaret, who shared the painting's history and the strange events surrounding it. People claim it shows them things, Margaret explained, her voice tinged with unease. Fears, regrets, moments they wish they could forget. But it's never the same for anyone. It's personal. Daniel decided to experience the painting for himself. He stood before the portrait of shadows, scrutinizing every detail. The woman's sorrowful expression, the black rose, the swirling shadows. At first, nothing happened. Then the shadows in the painting seemed to ripple, and the woman's eyes met his. Daniel suddenly found himself standing in a dimly lit hospital room. He recognized it immediately. It was the room where his mother had died years ago. He saw himself as a younger man, sitting at her bedside, his face etched with guilt. "Why didn't you stay longer?" his mother's voice whispered, though her lips didn't move. Daniel stumbled back, his heart pounding. The hospital room dissolved and he was back in the gallery, staring at the painting. He realized he was trembling. For years, he had blamed himself for not being by his mother's side when she passed. The painting had dredged up his guilt and forced him to confront it. Shaken but determined, Daniel vowed to dig deeper into the painting's origins. Through weeks of research, Daniel uncovered a chilling history. The painting had been created in the late 1800s by an enigmatic artist named Elias Blackwood, who was rumored to dabble in the occult. Blackwood had painted the portrait of shadows as a tribute to his late wife, Isabella, who had died under mysterious circumstances. He poured his grief, guilt, and rage into the painting, imbuing it with something unnatural. Shortly after completing the painting, Blackwood disappeared, and those who owned the painting after him reported the same disturbing phenomena: visions, hallucinations, and a sense of being watched. Some records suggested that Blackwood had bound a piece of Isabella's soul, or perhaps his own, to the painting, trapping them both in an eternal limbo. Daniel decided to test the painting's curse further, recruiting several volunteers to observe it under controlled conditions. Each participant reported a unique and horrifying vision. A man saw his late wife accusing him of causing her death. A woman witnessed her own funeral, with no one in attendance. A teenager saw himself lost in an endless, dark forest, pursued by unseen creatures. Daniel began to suspect that the painting acted as a mirror to the soul, reflecting its darkest secrets and fears. But why? And to what end? One stormy night, Daniel returned to the gallery alone, determined to confront the painting one last time. He wanted answers, and he believed the painting, or whatever resided within it, could provide them. As he stood before the portrait of shadows, the air grew heavy, and the shadows in the painting seemed to spill out into the room. The woman in the painting turned her head to look directly at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. "Why are you here?" a voice echoed, both in his mind and around him. "I want to understand," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadows engulfed him, and he was plunged into darkness. In the darkness, Daniel saw flashes of Isabella's life, her love for Elias, her untimely death, and the moment Elias bound her spirit to the painting. She had been trapped for over a century, forced to relive the pain of her death and the anguish of her husband's grief. "You must destroy it," Isabella's voice whispered. "Release us." When Daniel awoke, he was lying on the gallery floor, the painting looming above him. He knew what he had to do. The next day, Daniel convinced Margaret to close the gallery temporarily. Together, they took the painting to the outskirts of town and burned it. As the flames consumed the canvas, Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest. He thought he heard a soft sigh of relief, carried away on the wind. The curse was broken, and the portrait of shadows was no more. The gallery reopened without its most infamous piece, and though some mourned the loss of the mystery, most were relieved. Daniel returned to his life as a journalist, but he was forever changed. The painting had forced him to confront his guilt and find closure. And somewhere, in a place beyond human understanding, Elias and Isabella were finally at peace. In the quiet coastal town of Ashen Cove, whispers of an old curse circulated for generations. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of a cursed wedding ring, an antique band said to bring misfortune to anyone who wore it. Unlike typical superstitions, this curse wasn't confined to bad luck. Instead, it was far darker, forcing its wearer to relive their own death over and over again. The ring, known as the Widow's Band, had once belonged to a bride who had perished under mysterious circumstances on her wedding day. For years, the cursed artifact was thought lost to time, but when it surfaced again, tragedy soon followed. It began innocently enough. A young couple, Emily and James, were wandering through a local flea market, hunting for treasures for their upcoming wedding. Emily, a hopeless romantic, was drawn to antique items, believing each had a story to tell. Amidst the trinkets and oddities, she spotted the ring. It was a delicate gold band, adorned with tiny engravings of vines and roses. Despite its simplicity, the craftsmanship was exquisite, and Emily felt an instant connection to it. "How much for the ring?" she asked the vendor, an old woman with piercing gray eyes. The vendor hesitated, her expression clouding with unease. "That ring has history," she warned. "It's not meant for wear." Emily dismissed the warning, assuming it was a ploy to drive up the price. When James offered her the money, the old woman sighed and accepted, muttering something neither could understand. Emily slipped the ring onto her finger and marveled at its perfect fit. "It's like it was made for me," she said with a smile. That night, Emily woke with a start. Her heart was pounding, and her skin was clammy. She couldn't recall the details of her dream, but she remembered the sensation of falling and a sharp, searing pain in her chest. The following morning, she brushed it off as pre-wedding jitters, but James noticed her unease. "You okay?" he asked over breakfast. "Yeah, just a weird dream," she replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, the dreams grew more vivid. Each night, Emily found herself in a different place. Sometimes a forest, sometimes a desolate cliffside. The one constant was the ending. She always died. One night, she drowned in icy waters, the cold stealing her breath as she sank into darkness. Another night, she was struck by a carriage, the sound of splintering wood and her own screams echoing in her ears. The worst part was the pain. It felt real, too real. Each death left her gasping for air and clutching her chest. James grew increasingly concerned. "You're not sleeping, Emily. Maybe we should see a doctor." But Emily was reluctant to tell him the truth. She didn't want him to think she was losing her mind. One day, Emily visited the local library, desperate for answers. She scoured old records and archives, searching for anything about the ring. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon a story about a woman named Eleanor Gray, a bride from the 1800s who had tragically died on her wedding day. According to the records, Eleanor was found in her wedding gown, clutching the ring. Her death was ruled a suicide, though many suspected foul play. Locals claimed that Eleanor's grief and betrayal had bound her spirit to the ring, cursing it, and anyone who wore it, to experience death as she had. Emily's blood ran cold. She stared at the ring on her finger, suddenly feeling its weight. That night, Emily's dreams became even more harrowing. She found herself in a grand, candle-lit ballroom, dressed in an ornate wedding gown. Around her, ghostly figures danced in eerie silence, their faces blurred and indistinct. At the far end of the room, Eleanor stood, her face pale and her eyes hollow. "You wear my pain," Eleanor said, her voice echoing like a lament. "You will know my torment." Before Emily could respond, the vision shifted, and she was standing at the edge of a jagged cliff. A man, his face obscured by shadows, stood behind her. "You betrayed me," Eleanor's voice whispered again, this time filled with anguish. Emily felt a hand shove her forward. She plummeted into the dark abyss, the wind howling around her as she screamed. The next morning, Emily finally told James everything. "It's the ring," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's showing me things. Deaths, pain, suffering. It's like I'm living them." James was skeptical but agreed to help. They decided to return to the flea market and confront the vendor. When they found the old woman, she seemed unsurprised to see them. "I warned you," she said, shaking her head. "That ring is cursed. It binds its wearer to Eleanor's sorrow. Until you break the cycle, it won't let you go." "How do we break it?" James demanded. The vendor hesitated. "The curse feeds on guilt and betrayal. Eleanor was betrayed by someone she trusted, her lover. To end it, you must confront her pain and offer her peace." That night, Emily and James followed the vendor's instructions. They lit candles and placed the ring in the center of a circle of salt. Emily closed her eyes and focused, calling out to Eleanor. The air grew cold, and the room darkened as Eleanor's ghost appeared. Her gaze was filled with sorrow and rage. "You wear my pain," she said again, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know. Please tell me how to help you." Eleanor stared at her for a long moment before the shadows around her began to shift. "You must know the truth," Eleanor whispered. Emily was transported into a vision of the past. She saw Eleanor's wedding day, a joyous occasion that turned to tragedy when Eleanor discovered her fiancé's betrayal. Heartbroken, she fled to the cliffside where they had once promised their love. Her fiancé followed, not to console her, but to silence her. Emily watched in horror as Eleanor was pushed to her death, the betrayal and pain forever binding her soul to the ring. When the vision ended, Emily felt a surge of determination. "Eleanor, you were wronged," she said, "but you don't have to hold on to this pain. Let it go. Find peace." Eleanor's ghost hesitated before nodding slowly. The shadows around her dissipated and she faded into the light. The ring cracked and shattered, its curse finally broken. Emily and James buried the remains of the ring near the cliffside where Eleanor had died, marking the spot with flowers. Though the curse was gone, Emily was forever changed by the experience. She gained a deep appreciation for life and love, vowing to cherish every moment. And as the wind swept over Ashen Cove, it carried with it a whisper of gratitude from a soul finally set free.